So I'm Joe Nguyen. I'm with ComScore, and you might wonder, like, what do I have to do with smart cities? I sort of got into smart cities about a couple of years ago. For those of me who know, those here who know me, sort of, I'm infamous. As in, like, a couple of years, 2.5 years ago, I decided to buy a Tesla and bring it to Singapore. And I got into Singapore about 2.5 years ago. And then it took me 7 months to get it registered. And it became the first Tesla registered on the road in Singapore. And I had to pay, what essentially it was deemed as inefficient, so I had to pay emissions levy. And if you remember a couple of years, it made sort of the press. It just went viral. It just went mad. Since then, I've had a number of discussions with a number of parties and got into sort of, how does electrification, how do governments work with smart cities and stuff like that. So hence, I'm here. But I'm not the expert. These guys here do work on this stuff on a daily basis. So I'm going to kick off the session really quickly. With a very simple question. What is a smart city? And I'll start with you. And just an idea of what it is to you, and what do you do on a daily basis?
I'll answer the question more than talk about what I do on a daily basis, because we're just touching on a slice. Just as reference, I run a robotics company which focuses on micromobility. That's basically transportation for 1 and 2 people, small vehicles, what we think will be the majority of trips in cities as time goes by. But more broadly, before doing this full time, I was at MIT at the Sensible City Lab, where I ran half the operation for about a decade. And we're focusing on smart cities. The key thing I think that stuck with me is smart cities are just a natural evolution of the web. It's something as virtual as the internet now merging with physical space. Almost everything becomes online, becomes addressable, and that's a condition. That's sort of an opportunity that we have. The question now is, the city will become smart if we do interesting things with that new condition. And in my mind, one of the most interesting things that is to be done is to think of that infrastructure just like we think of our street infrastructure, real estate, everything else, is to make it robust enough, define some laws around it, and then let the people or the industry, academia, et cetera, do the rest, build the rest on top. So I'm going to leave it at this abstract level, meaning we can talk about applications, and we will in a little bit, but it's important not to think about this as a top-down sort of orchestration of let's connect just the vehicle to the train to the smart grid. Yes, that will happen, and that is great, but that's such a small part of the puzzle. There's a lot more we can do with this incredible infrastructure to make lives better in cities.
Marc Lab Campus,
we briefly heard from Alessia. It's a new innovation campus that we're building at Munich Airport with about 500,000 meters of square. You can call Lab Campus a smart city for innovation. I mean, we want to build there based on the latest trends, both in the physical and digital trends. We want to build there a place where people and companies come together to be creative and where they can collaborate. So we want to build it efficient, we want to build it secure, we want to build it sustainable. We want to build an environment which is suited to the new needs of work for the people there. And we also want to bring the people together, the people and the companies together every day. So you can look at it a little bit as a DLD on a daily basis. So this is about what we want to achieve in Lab Campus. And Lab Campus will be, as we can build it from scratch, we are now able to implement all these new technologies already in there. So we don't have a legacy as a normal city has. So we invite the companies which come with us on Lab Campus to shape it also with us. So what is a smart city for me? I'm not an explicit expert on smart cities, but for me, a smart city is an evolution of a city. I mean, you see it as industry You had the evolution from industry to industry 4.0. So for me, that's an evolution step of a city. And for me, it combines all the trends that we see when we talk about digitization. So it's not only about data, but it's also about things like perception-driven robotics. It's things about, we heard about blockchain today. It's things about artificial intelligence, all these trends which are out there. And what I like very much when talking about smart city is that we put an application in the focus, and we put the humans in the focus, because a city is for human beings.
So I'm going to jump right now, right, to Marco, because you were talking about the human, right? So you're a designer, but you're very UX. I'll come back to you in a little bit, and that's been your experience, right?
Yeah. So I'm Marco Pedrazoo. I work for a company called Carlo Ratti Associati. We are in the design domain, so not really in the technological domain, but of course designing today for us, it's having a look at how the digital domain is changing the way in which we think and conceive the physical domain, so cities in particular. We seldom speak about smart cities. We call it sensible cities as the Sensible City Lab, with two specific meanings. The first one is a city that's able to sense, so to understand what's going on thanks to all the availability of data that's coming up. And the second meaning is sensible, and sensible exactly to what he was saying, to human beings. Because at the end of the day, everything that we put in place, it's for specific application for human being and for enhancing the quality of life and move humanity forward. So in a sense, what we do is try to understand what could be the new paradigm for people, and then derive the technology to be designed and implemented. So of course, as Asaf said, you need to have a sort of infrastructure, an underlying infrastructure. You need to cope with the data availability, what you have, what's there, what's missing. But at the end of the day, yeah, it's human first, and then technology follows.
So Pictet, Ivo, I mean, you have a fund to invest in smart cities. So what are you looking at? Like, what kind of things would you consider a smart city that this fund would actually consider investing in?
Yeah, so briefly wrapping up what has already been said, I think the key word for me is what Marco just said, quality of life improvements. So it's all about improving outcomes for people, for city residents, in a really big and broad array of different areas, right? And everybody also defines quality of life a bit differently. There are certain things which are more important for some people and others for others. But it's all about, for instance, like reducing their commuting time, making them healthier, creating recreational opportunities as well, social infrastructure, also oftentimes intangible things like social connectedness, how well do people really connected with their surroundings, not only their city, but their local communities. And sustainability plays a huge important role, right? So it's quite broad. And therefore, we also find investment opportunities in quite a broad range of sectors, right? Because in the end, it's about the human, about improving outcomes, but therefore, you also need physical things, right? You need infrastructure that's forward-looking. You need to design the cities of tomorrow. You need to execute. Mobility is a big, important theme, right? So
is this a medium-term or long-term investment?
Yes, it's very, very long-term. One general thing we do when we create a theme fund, we identify what we call mega trends, and we don't identify them ourselves. Here we rely on the Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies. They have a list of mega trends, and these are contrary to like short-term trends or sometimes fads, really long-term pervasive trends, which are to shape our societies and economies for the decades to come. And here we have mainly three that are present. It's demographic changes, with urbanization being the most important single subcomponent of that, but also some other things like growing and aging populations, changing family patterns. People, at least in the development world, are getting married later, are having fewer children because of higher female participation in the workforce. And all this changes also how people are going to live, and therefore also how cities need to be built, right? You need a different type of housing, for instance. And then combined with the sustainability angle, which is the biggest issue for cities today and also for the future, and technology, which is the key enabler, there you have these three megatrends present, which really drive the theme of smart city for us.
So you were touching base on this before as well, the sensors and everything. So really, it's it's been said in the last few years, data is the new oil, right? And so when we're talking about a smart city, data is like essential.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you an example from our world. And I think yes, data is important, but a smart city has two-way communication, right? It's not just learning what's going on. It's also impacting what's happening, right? That's where you can really start to influence things, right? That's where, if you talk about, at the end of the day, we want to make people's lives better, it's very hard to do that just by observation, right? You want to eventually move physical things in the city, help people make decisions. So I'll give you one example from our world. So we make vehicles, tiny vehicles, that sustain themselves in the wild, and that involves some level of, there's a lot of sensors.
Sustain themselves in the wild, like
Meaning
solar powered and all that kind of stuff?
Meaning they require minimal,
They go build themselves and then take over the world?
What they do is basically they figure out what's wrong with themselves, and they apply some level of self-protection and self-correction. So there's a lot of sensors inside, a lot of quite a bit of learning. And the goal is to make them very, very cheap so that you can deploy them and worry about them as little as possible. And they're deployed on shared fleets, like the ones deployed by Uber, Didi, Meituan, etc. And so data is a central thing to be able to develop a vehicle like that, right? Data from the vehicle, from other vehicles, and from the environment it rides within, from the riders, data about demand, data about traffic, et cetera, et cetera. However, if we were not able to close the loop, and at the end of the day use that to move a person, or to control a machine, a vehicle, right? It's a lot, from our perspective, it's a lot less compelling. The data, what you do with it eventually is you feed it back into the city and you actuate. Right? So to me, that's the most exciting thing that happens right now is actually the merger between robotics and data. Right? Because then you have things that can act based on real information and start to do some meaningful things.
So, Marco, what kind of data infrastructure are you building at the Munich airport?
Well, I agree. I think it's too short just to talk about data. I mean, if you talk about smart city, then you first need to have some kind of communication layer. You know, you need to have both from a mobile perspective, on a fixed perspective. You need to have the layer the sensors and the actuators can communicate with. Then you have this sensor layer, which collects the data, and then you have a data layer and you have an application layer. So what I agree with Asaf is that it's really most important for me is on the one side that on this data layer, you need to have a neutral access. So it's really, you don't have monopolies on data, but you're really able that everybody can participate, everybody can innovate on this data which is being generated. And then on top you have an application layer. And then also for this you need to have some cities need to have some basics, but you need to also have the freedom for startups to come in and to innovate.
So the biggest monopoly of data, if you will, besides Google and Facebook, the governments, right? For smart cities, right? They have
Facebook is a lot bigger.
yeah, different data. So let's say Google and Facebook aside, but within the urban environment, right? Whether it's traffic patterns, water, all that stuff, right? It's the governments, right? How open are the governments to being a part of this stuff, making it open, making it accessible? Any thoughts?
Very open. I mean, I can tell you, at least from my experience at the Sensible City Lab, we build three-way partnerships. We have a framework there under a consortium where you bring together mayors, so to speak, which is basically standing for government, larger scale or the city scale, corporations, usually Fortune 50 companies, and researchers. And the basis of this is that the city, when it joins, it pays a commitment fee that's very low just to show up at the meetings. But it has to make itself available.
You have to pay to show up at a meeting?
No, meaning that if they don't pay, they don't show up at the meeting. But the key point, what they really bring to the table is the problem domain, right? A real world problem that if we solve would make a meaningful difference on the world and people's quality of life, but also give us data and be open for us to do experimental deployments. And the response is incredible. They're the first to jump in. Like cities get the point, mayors today, so to speak, understand the most of them, the potential of technology, and are really wishing to have help, to have ideas, to have things to deploy. So I think the response.
Are governments helping to facilitate?
I think that it's really interesting to see how some cities in some part of the world are moving towards that direction, but it's also true that the temptation to take over the data domain from a government perspective is also tempting, and I think that still it's important to as people working in the domain of technology and designing potential application for it, recognize the fact that technology is not good or bad, but it's never neutral as well. So I think it's really in our role as people that are working in the domain to put on the table conversation like the one that Asaf said, in which everybody is sitting at the same table with a fair share of responsibility and different domain of expertise in order for the government to build this shared infrastructure that we discussed before, and for innovation to come up and arise from the bottom within that framework.
Has anyone run across governments that are actually putting up frameworks and to enable different companies to tap into it?
The London effort, for example, in opening all their data assets, it could be a good example of it. I think that more and more cities are moving towards
the European Commission.
Yeah. I think the government could do more, I mean, at least from my perspective, from Central Europe, because governments mainly understand digitization and also smart cities by infrastructure, deploying infrastructure, and maybe also giving some research gifts or giving some research money. I think they should also take more the application view. Because at least, I mean, for some, at least in Germany, I see it that it's difficult. I mean, we sometimes have a law, like the labor law or the new data protection law, which is not really giving enough room for the people to innovate. So the government should take more this application perspective, really understand what also companies need to innovate, where there are limitations. But on the other side, they also need to prevent monopolies. So it's probably not easy. And you can see it with the new data protection law. They wanted to fight off the monopoly. But what came out is now making life difficult for smaller companies, because they have all these lawyers around.
Right, so more on the GDPR, data protection, all that fun stuff. So as data is flowing through and everyone's accessing it and for smart cities and everything, what the ethics of privacy, the ethics of what does the government know, what does the individual city knows about each person, how has that been discussed? Has that been sort of in play within the governments, within the framework?
All the time. And it really depends at which phase of the technology deployment you're in. When it comes to what we do at Super Pedestrian, which is very much business driven and it's very much execution driven, you take very little risk, right? So you aggregate, you anonymize, and you do as little as you can with the data, right? You use it for what you need, and you try to keep your options open. And we don't have data about people really, more about the machines and what happens to machines, to vehicles as they move. But when it comes to the discussion with governments and when it comes to research, data is crucial. You want to be able to experiment, first and foremost. At the moment, we're just scratching the surface in terms of finding meaningful applications for new technologies in cities. But I think there's a general sense that the sky is the limit there. However, the experimentation process requires taking some risk. And the question is, how do you create those petri dishes where you can experiment in cities? And the good news is that there are places that are open for that. But it requires flexing on the laws in terms of privacy. It requires getting, actually here in Singapore, the Prime Minister's office funded a 10-year project with MIT. Sensible City Lab was a major part of this, where we took data from Land Transport Authority, Singtel, the Smart Grid experiment in the Southwest, all the loop detectors to count cars in the streets, the ERP, incoming and outgoing freight from the port, people through the airport. And the idea was to use that data, which was totally anonymized before we got it, in order to start to ask, how can you move more people through the streets if you're able to observe the flows through the place? So how can we get more transportation without building more roads? Use it smarter. The government was a big part of reaching out to these private, sometimes organizations, and getting them to participate in understanding how can you do this in a way that would maintain data privacy and security, but made it happen eventually.
Marc, what about the urban development kind of view of things?
Well, I think we need to have a further discussion on data privacy, because we see that in the Asian countries probably the data privacy is not such a big topic, but in the Europeans it's a bit more. So I think,
let's not talk about China.
I know, but I think we need to
not an issue there.
we need to have a more closer look at that, and we need to have more discussions on that. I also think that there may be some other effects which will come into account when we talk about the rights of an individual, which is, I mean, we will see a lot of applications probably in the future which allow some kind of premium service when you pay for it. You know, I mean, we may have some kind of congestion pricing, so if there's a traffic jam, then you have to pay more for it, or the others just have to pass around. And this will be, it will further increase some kind of the gap between the rich people and the poor people. And this is something we need to look at, because in a city, it comes together. You know, imagine that somebody who's ordering with Amazon a parcel delivery with a drone, then he pays for it, but the other people who are living aside and who are seeing this drone and who are listening to it have to pay the price for it. So I think this question, individual versus, I mean, also in competition, individual towards each other, and the community is something that we should further discuss from a society perspective.
Is privacy something that some of the stuff that's coming to you, Ivo, as part of the plans?
Yeah, we talk to companies mostly. We invest in or try to invest in, and obviously these discussions we're having them all the time, right? Is the mic? Okay, I have to speak a bit more towards that. So we're having the discussion with the companies we're investing or trying to invest in all the time. We're not directly in contact, obviously, with governments or so on to talk through these issues, but that's why I'm very grateful for these insights I'm getting from people like Asaf, who are actually developing business models on the ground. But I think, data is a key enabler, right? You need data, and you need to make it accessible, but also then, as always, right, there's a fine line between what is enough data and where does it start to infringe privacy maybe, right? How much do you know about an individual and how much should you know?
But the key thing is that the government doesn't have the data you need, right? And that's a really important point to keep in mind, that if you wanted today, let's imagine, smart education, smart healthcare, transportation, ask yourself what portion of the data that you need is in the hands of the public or the government. A small one.
This is Singapore. All of those things are.
But to an extent. First of all, Singapore in that sense is an outlier. It is an outlier, first of all. And by the way, I don't think so, because
Maybe different pockets for sure, but you know.
The key thing you want to learn about is, so the city itself is a lump of concrete and steel for the most part. It doesn't change very fast, right? It has a lot of inertia. What flows through it is the stuff you want to measure, whether it is energy, people, goods, resources, right? And that stuff is information that's usually in the hands of companies, in the hands of basically the industry. So, and a lot of it is being generated by new business models, like what Facebook is doing. And that's the stuff that really becomes useful when you start to cross it with other types of data and feed it back into the city. So thinking that if a city just opens its data sources, let's imagine everything was hunky-dory, then we got the magic, sort of the magic solution for everything. No, it's a small portion of what we need. But it's important, but it's small.
But I think that in that respect, the GDPR is a good, interesting mutation within the system, because at least in terms of basic concept, I don't know like the bill in detail, but the idea that data belongs to the person that has generated it, it's potentially a huge game changer in that sense, because if they're not owned by different giant companies, but they are up to me, I can decide what to share in exchange for better services. So I can live in a total, complete privacy, but have a dumb healthcare system or a dumb transportation system, or I can share the data in order to receive.
That's one view of this, but there's a side effect that I think is at least as interesting, which is if you were today entrepreneur X and you have an idea for some fundamental healthcare solution that relies on data from Facebook, I just made it up. You can't put your hands on that data at the moment. But with GDPR, users can take that data from Facebook and give it to you. And now it's going to be hard to execute, but once that begins to happen on a massive scale, then there is a massive opportunity also. Because you can do that with Google, with Facebook, with any other thing that might come up, and start to have cross-references that will result in completely new services. right? So you'll have this sort of almost like a trading of an exchange of data.
That would be, for me, also a requirement for the government, I mean, or the cities, because I think it's not about ownership, so the government doesn't need to own it, or the city doesn't need to own it, but what they need to give opportunity to is that it's centrally collected and it's available for usage under certain circumstances.
You're never going to have it centrally collected.
But you need to have some
Maybe
data.
here,
but you need to have some data pools where you can start on. And I think a city is a good starting point because they already have something. The city gives us a new opportunity to collect something because this is the only area, basically, where there's something in public hand which you can extend.
So it's all on a token somewhere.
Excuse me?
It's all on a token somewhere.
I mean, it takes us back to the beginning of the conversation, right?
I have some more questions. Any questions at the moment? We've got one here. Who's got the mic?
We read a lot about the design of smart cities in science fiction novels or see it in movies. If you were to paint the picture of a really smart city in an ideal scenario, what would it look like?
Ivo, let's start with you, because you're putting money into it.
Look, I think there is no one ideal city, right? But there are a few cities out there which are being built from scratch, which is a very interesting experiment, obviously, right? Because you're not stuck with some legacy infrastructure or other legacy assets you need to build around, right? But in the end, it really depends on what are the goals, and we talked about improving outcomes for people, and then you have to narrow it down to individual sub goals and targets, right? For instance, reduce commuting time, make everything accessible via walkable areas or within short distances so people can use bicycles, right? Because as soon as the commuting distance exceeds a certain threshold and people start using motorized transport again, and so on and so forth. You assemble all of these subcomponents, like smart buildings, energy efficient buildings, talk about transportation systems, government institutions, social infrastructure, but then you can do so many things and assemble them in a different way, and I think it will be also an iterative process because once you're trying to resolve one problem, you may be creating the next one without even noticing it. And then over time, cities will become better, right? But I think this is really an evolutionary process. And there is also no one smart city out there, and I think there never will be. It's all just, we're talking about smart city concepts, right? So gradual improvements and individual things about one city may be very smart, but then in other respects, it's very dumb. And in another city, that's also why there are so many rankings out there. You can find so many studies about what are the best or the smartest city in the world, right? And then some things always come up, like Singapore or Copenhagen, but depending on what the study focuses on, the results can be quite different, right? Because if we're talking about livability, is one thing. If we're talking about economic power, education, and so on, it's different, right? So I'm sorry to not be able to give you a concrete answer, but I think smart city is more of a concept for gradual improvements, and we're working on these.
Well, as for you guys, pick a movie. Which one's your favorite that says what a smart city is? Think about it. I mean, the problem. Think about it. But the problem with movies is that there's always a darker subtext to every. It's like, oh, it's a smart city, and then all hell breaks loose, and robots come out killing people. But pick a movie that you think is a good idea of a smart city.
Of course, the Black Mirror.
Black Mirror. Which episode?
I would love to build a little bit on top of what Ivo said because, I do really believe the smart city is local. It's it harnesses world trends, but it's really local. Mobility in the center of Boston, it's different from the mobility in the city center of Turin, and it's different from the mobility in Bangkok. Of course, there are commonalities, but it needs to be very local. The second thing that I would try to picture in people's mind is we discussed data generated from the city, but we need to actuate and have an environment that changes according to what is happening toward the city. So just to give you an example, we designed a building in Turin for a huge co-working space, and in there people get localized if they want through their mobile app to access that they use to access the space and book the meeting rooms. And they can provide their own comfort zone in terms of heating and cooling. And then what the system does, it follows you and create a sort of heat bubble so that all of a sudden you don't have to heat up the whole building anymore, but it's just heating up a specific bubble around the user. And that's just one example that could be scaled up to the dimension of the city. And the third pictures in terms of how do I think a smart city looks like, it's really actually an old paradigm, which is the Gothic cathedral one. So you have this underlying architecture of data, but then the people inside that with the chisel creates every single piece of the cathedral are very different and changes over time, and still the whole at the end of the process is a beautiful piece of artwork. So I think it's the collaboration probably, it's the third picture that I would subscribe to.
Yeah, I neither can give a picture of the future, sorry. What I don't like about these normal pictures I see is that they are too much technology driven. You know, you see all these kind of new technologies which are there. They are so fancy and it's so nice, but for me it's too less driven from, or depending too much what we will accept as a human being. You know, I talked about the drones flying around, or some people in Germany talk about the flight taxis. I cannot imagine that these things become real. I mean, imagine you look on the sky and the sky is just populated by everything. I mean, that's nothing which we will accept. And that's, I think we should look more from the demand side. But I think there's a huge potential in midterm, and we heard it already, it's local. I would even go so far that it's based on a certain area of a city, because in some you may have security issues that you may address with some kind of gunfire protection or whatsoever. In the others, you have some kind of water resource problem, then you solve this there, or you have some mobility problem, then you solve this. So there's so many opportunities. The smart city concepts can really create a value that I think that's really promising. And I think just the one big picture, that's how it will look like, is just too short, because it cannot really reflect all the numerous opportunities that you have on the specific topics.
Asaf, any idea on the smart city utopia?
I'll give a similarly non-committal answer, but not because I don't want to make a guess, but I really think we shouldn't. That's the point, right? That's the point that also that Marco made earlier, that it needs to evolve out of real need, which is very specific to a specific place. But I want to ask a question. Why do people come together in cities, right? The cities have been around for 6.5 millennia. And what we see, and that's been well studied over the past 2 decades, is cities are the places where ideas happen, right? So that's where humans interact to invent new things. Exchange genes, that's where we mate, right? So gene diversity scales superlinearly with city size. The number of patents per capita scales superlinearly with city size. GDP, we exchange money, right? We create business models. Exchange scales superlinearly with city size. So what it means to me is that cities exist so that we can come together and exchange bodily fluids or ideas or cash, whatever it is. And in that context, a smart city, in that context is a city that enables us to do that in a better way, right? So what it means is to interact personally. It means that you need to be able to move effectively, right? So walkability, short distances, close proximity, connectedness, right? And that is on the physical level as well as on the information level. And the other thing has to do with the platform for collaboration. So people create, they need a canvas to create on, right? Just like, when the Romans used to build a city, they would parcel the land, build the key roads, maybe 2 or 3 types of infrastructure, create rules for land use, and let people do everything else, right? So I think that's a very good analogy. We then went the opposite direction during modernist era. In the beginning of the previous century, thought that we know everything, and we need to design a city which is very precise and tells you what to do. That failed, right? So if we learn from Roman era and we really apply that again to to the digital opportunity, I think that's the path toward a smart city.
You were saying?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think you can conclude from all what we're saying basically that cities are the new countries, right? And we will really compare cities to cities and not like countries anymore, right? In the case of Singapore, both are the same, right? But we'll not compare like Germany to China to the US, so it will compare London to New York to Shanghai, right?
Right, and that goes into sort of, so like you said, Singapore is easy, right? And then you have, I think the Prime Minister of India just said he's going to build 100 smart cities in India by like 2025 or something like that. I mean, and countries, you know, you've got one population, but larger countries, how do you balance the fact that some cities, you know, can central governments actually help cities do this, or is it going to be, you know, New York's going to be really cool, LA is going to be different, and everything in between is meh?
It is.
Well, I think there are some things they can do. We talked about this communication layer. We talked about the sensor layer. If we talk about the application layer, then there for sure will be some areas, government services whatsoever, which need to be in common. But otherwise, yes, I fully agree what you said. It depends on the city, and the solutions will be specific for the city because they have specific problems.
So the mayors and maybe the state level need to figure it out and work with.
Yeah, they can have benchmarking partners, as you mentioned. You know, they need to benchmark, but it doesn't necessarily need to be in the country. But it needs to be can be the city which is most equal to the demand. But for sure, there need to be a layer on top which gives some kind of guidance, and that's maybe what a government can do. That just not because of limited money or whatsoever, you just fall behind because one city is richer than the other. These are some things that the government could do.
I think that's even more than that, because it's even within the same city you have an increasing gap due to technological disruption. Think about, you know, Uber driver versus taxi driver, robotics, the robotic advance in respect to factory workers. It's true that all these technological changes are creating more job places. The problem is that they are different from the one that we used to have. So we have also tension in between the city, between the workforce that's getting out of business, basically, thanks to technological disruption, and the new one that needs to be educated and get inside this, the workforce. So I think that probably it's a discussion about a pact for citizenship really that needs to be done in order to try to see how we can balance all this social tension and avoid problems of, you know, rising populism and similar things.
Any questions? Everyone good for the moment? So is smart cities sort of complementary to sustainability as a whole? Right? I mean, I don't like to talk green, because if you say you're green, everyone's like, why do you even have a car? Like, shouldn't you be eating organic food and riding a bicycle? But sustainability is a whole different, like, you know, how do we keep the human race going? I mean, is that part of the equation for smart cities?
That's a key ingredient, or it's basically a prerequisite, right? If cities don't become sustainable, this whole thing will not work, right? Urbanization is increasing. 4 billion people live in cities today. It's 55% of the global population. It's going to 70% by 2050, I think. And the world population is growing. And already today we have all these issues, right? So it's only going to work with an increased focus on sustainability, right? And I think on a supranational level, a lot of people have recognized this. The United Nations have their Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 SDGs. SDG number 11 talks about sustainable cities and communities. And the goal is to make them inclusive, safe, sustainable, and resilient. The question is, how do you break this down then not on a national, but on a local level? But I think also, this is why more mayors and like local cities become aware of these issues, because they see them day to day in their cities. Those that become popular, you feel the side effects and you need to act, right?
I mean, if you think about the point you just mentioned, so I mean, I guess the obvious answer is definitely it needs to be in the center of almost everything we do. in cities in general, smart or call it what you want, to make them sustainable. But technology is not necessarily going to enable us to be more sustainable. Right? We have to aim that way. And I'll give you an example. Transportation. So cities are growing at an unprecedented rate, and demand for urban mobility grows even faster because of the GDP growth in cities, compounding effects, middle class growth, et cetera. So we're in the middle of a curve that started in the late 80s of exponential growth in demand for urban mobility and exponential decline in mobility outside. And already we have many cities that are at a gridlock. Now we're adding self-driving parcels, right? And population keeps on growing, and cities keep on growing. What it means is that our infrastructure is under a lot of pressure already today, and people ask a question, how are we going to solve traffic? We're going to be lucky if we keep today's traffic, given all this, right? And take the example of self-driving cars, right? Self-driving cars could lead us also in a non-sustainable direction, because unless we think about the form factor of that vehicle and what you do when you move, we could end up, if it's cheap enough and easy enough, we could end up starting to move for reasons that we don't move today. I'll give you an example. You could have a moving bedroom. You could have a moving living room, a moving anything else, right? And all of a sudden, we're moving, whereas today, we're creating basically new demand. It's induced demand for mobility, and that would be unsustainable by design. So we need to aim certain ways in order to reach a sustainable goal. Technology doesn't lend itself. It's neutral.
Well, in Asia, we have our fair share of good luck in most of the cities here. Any thoughts on sustainability? I mean, what is Lab Campus doing in terms of?
I can just repeat that what my colleagues see. I think sustainability is key, and I mean, as smart cities is also a lot about efficiency. It's efficiency for energy consumption. It's waste management. It's for water, power management. All that is included there. So I think it is there as a big trend, but I wouldn't put it as I mean, for me, it's still a balance also, put the human being, the needs in the front. So I wouldn't put it on the center and to do everything for it, but I think it needs to be balanced. But I mean, we have great opportunities which we discussed. I mean, because I worked previously for Siemens, so their vision is with autonomous driving vehicles, the whole inner city will be blocked. There will be parking houses where you put your own car, regardless if it's autonomous or not. And then there will be only limited autonomous cars driving you to where you want. And then you suddenly have much less traffic there. So all these opportunities are there.
I don't see it, honestly.
We need to discuss it.
I don't see it, because what's the difference between that and just having an Uber driver today? It's the same thing, right? Okay, so it's cheaper. It's a matter of price.
There's much less cars.
No, I'm saying, let's say you can block a city today and only put, an Uber-like service there, driven by a robot or by a human, won't change the aspect of traffic. What changes the aspect of traffic is the number of people you can flow through a street per minute. And that has to do with the fact that we're driving cars that are 80% empty. Right? That's not going to change if you put a robot as a driver.
Yeah,
unless we rethink the form factor of the vehicle itself and shrink it to our size, we're going to be stuck.
That's right, but there I would have the hope that the trends we have with smart city and also with autonomous vehicles will lead to a trigger point where people realize that this is now possible. Something new is creating, so the minds may change, although there may be similar concepts in the past. Fine.
There's always the Jetsons, right?
It may really something say, now it's possible, let's do it.
Right, someone's going to innovate well, they're trying to build flying cars. Now, is it efficient or not? That's a whole different question, right?
There's a reason why we're on the ground.
I don't want to have flying cars. I don't want to have it, I just remember when it's blue sky and I look up and I just see drones and whatever flying around. That's not a city I want to live in.
Drones are big enough to carry people now.
I'll give you a basic equation. It takes about an order of magnitude more energy to lift you up in the air than just to move, to lift you up 1 meter than just to move 1 meter, especially if you're using a helicopter-like propulsion. So by definition, as soon as you elevate, all concepts of limiting energy consumption or sustainability are out the window, let alone the limited space. So it will make sense when you don't have ground infrastructure. If you're in southern Sudan, yes, fine, flying cars because you don't have roads. Or if you're very wealthy and you want to go from SFO to Palo Alto, But in the middle of the city, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and especially because all that energy is going to be discharged in forms of airflow onto the people that stays on the ground, being at their coffee table. Yeah, it's true. Like imagine like
good
you
here.
blow out the tables, and it's just not possible. Doesn't work.
So, as you can see, we had a discussion last night, and a discussion on smart cities just starts to evolve into a number of different things, because it is actually such a all-encompassing like future for us, for all of us. Any questions before I go into the last one? No. All right. You mentioned this before. Are smart cities inevitable? Like,
What do you think?
Yeah, if you think about them in the way I spoke before, that smart cities are not like one fixed, complete city, but smart city is an evolutionary process, then it is inevitable, because otherwise, I said, it's going to break down, right? It's going to get too much. Either you have to revert the trend of urbanization, because cities become so unlivable that people start moving there, or they become better, right? And if you define smart city as cities becoming more efficient, safer, more sustainable, then they are inevitable, yes.
Yeah, I would agree. In the very moment in which everybody has a smartphone in their pocket, you basically have already like the very basic level of a smart city. You have data availability, you are producing data, you are taking your decision based on what information your mobile phone is giving you. So in a sense, in a very nutshell, you already have a smart city, because you have smart citizens that can take different decisions according to their data availability.
So any estimates as to a timeline that certain cities will become what would be considered smart cities? Because the definition is sort of not quite clear.
It's already happening, right? I mean, we spoke about this yesterday. Let's take one very simple example. Almost something that sounds trivial today. A service like Waze, the traffic service. That's in a sense you can call it a smart city service. Right? They did not need a permit from a mayor. They did not need data from a city. They just utilized the fact that we volunteer our information when we move for better information about how to move. And everybody's benefiting from this. And to the point that cities are now taking that data to improve on other things. And that's a smart city service. And that's ubiquitous all around the world. And we're seeing more and more of this. So I think, in a sense, it is inevitable that cities will become partly physical, partly digital, just because that's, the evolution of technology is clearly going there, right? What do we do with this? Is it going to be smart or not? I think it's really up to us, right? And so we spoke earlier about what could be the right ways to make sure that we build these as infrastructures that people can collaborate on, can eventually interact more effectively on, build businesses on, et cetera, et cetera.
And governments can issue parking tickets more efficiently.
Maybe I can add also something to this. For me, innovation, you can never stop innovation. You can never stop progress. And I think everybody of us, the lives of everybody of us will change in the next 10 to 15, maybe 20 years significantly. So we see all the trends out there with artificial intelligence, everything you can do with data, perception-driven robotics, all these kind of things will change our lives significantly. And they will also change it, they will both change it in our work life. I mean, the work we are doing, the work how we are supported, the products that we have, and they will also change our private life. So I think for us, it's really key that we are not driven by the technology, but we try to really define on how we want to live, how we want to use it. And that's where I also see the major risk, because it may not be aware to a lot of people what kind of jobs may be gone when you have all these systems out there which are driven by the new robotics or by the new artificial intelligence, but it will be huge. And we need to think what we do with that.
Any guesses as to what would be the first smart city?
I would say Lab Campus, but it's probably not.
You're not a city, you're just a few blocks, 500 square thousand meters or something.
There's not going to be a single one, right? It's very obvious.
Not China, not something in Beijing, not something in Europe, Berlin, Munich, Singapore?
As I told you before, smart city is more abstract than maybe a concrete city, right? So.
I think that probably what you're trying to picture is this idea of a city that's already responding, like changing in terms of a third skin to what we are doing within the city. So in that respect, probably like physically adapting and changing, it is already happening. Like when Asaf was quoting Waze, people changes their pattern of mobility according to what they see. And for the hard architecture to adapt physically to change the dynamics, of course, that will take ages, but
maybe one way to summarize this is that this is a process that's happening in some ways very, very fast, in other ways very, very slow. But we're in the middle of it already, and I don't think you'll see sort of a switch one day with I'm smart. It's an evolutionary process that's happening, and we're in the middle of it.
Cool. We're out of time. I'll wrap it with that. So smart cities are inevitable. If you guys know which one it is, you might want to move there before other people. It'll get crowded. Get the real estate there before other people do. All right, thank you very much, and have a good conference.